We are approaching the end of 2025, it's coming quickly, and it's a year that Bungie, in a lot of ways, I think will be happy to see the back of. Of course, all game studios or IPs have their ups and downs. Safe to say that's been the same for Bungie and Destiny over the years, but 2025 in particular was a year that saw a lot of difficulties for Bungie. And a small amount of that, you could argue, is kind of bad luck, but the majority of it is the culmination of missteps and decision-making inside of the studio that ultimately led us to this point. And of course, some of that was kickstarted by the layoffs at Bungie, which began before the final shape and of course, continued shortly after final shape. And then, in a lot of ways, while I'm sure that was very difficult internally at Bungie, the legacy that left behind was kind of felt by players much more in 2025, as we got eyes on Marathon, and of course in the ways that affected Destiny 2. So it's an interesting conversation. 2025 started out with episode Heresy for D2, and Heresy was an interesting one because it was the last episode of the year, and that Destiny year had begun with the final shape drop-in. That was an absolute banger of an expansion, and we had episode Echoes alongside it, which in many ways was kind of carried by the fact that it was alongside the final shape. Then we got to episode Revenant, which I think had a pretty lukewarm reception. And as we see with every year of Destiny content, player numbers kind of dropped off, and there was a lot of player fatigue in general. But while not everyone will agree, Heresy at the start of 2025 was a relative high point in the episode cadence. Nostalgia was probably a contributing factor to that. There are a lot of players who remember the Taken King very fondly, and were excited to see the Dreadnought return. Plus, Heresy had some pretty cool weapons, gear, a decent exotic mission, and a fair amount of pursuit built into it. So while not everyone was a massive fan, and not everyone necessarily even played it, those that did stick around for it, on the most part, found it to be one of the better seasons and certainly the best episode of the final shape year. So in some ways, that was a pretty good start to 2025 for Bungie. Next up, we had Marathon though, and I'm not saying it to be mean or to hammer at Bungie unnecessarily, but the announcement for Marathon was an absolute disaster on the most part. And that isn't just because the initial announcement saw a kind of lukewarm reception, but it's what happened in the wake of that, where we had the stolen art drama, and in combination with that lukewarm reception, and the fact that by this point it was almost popular to hate on Bungie because they'd had the 2 big rounds of layoffs, and there was also minimal communication about where we would go next with Destiny 2, which almost made for the perfect storm where a lot of people that have existed in the Destiny community for many years felt a bit salty, let's be real, in relation to Marathon. And yeah, not all of that was uncalled for. Bungie showed Marathon off in a pretty early state. Some of that is potentially because they'd rebooted the game just a couple of years before it was ever revealed. So it was ultimately not as content rich as players hoped it was going to be, and was missing a lot of features and all of that kind of stuff. Ultimately, it was not the way that Bungie wanted Marathon to be received when it was actually revealed to the world. Bungie acknowledged that, and they almost kind of tucked Marathon away to one side, which ultimately opened up the conversation for Year of Prophecy in Destiny 2. As Bungie were announcing Year of Prophecy and revealing all of the things that they were changing, I think there was a lot of trepidation, especially in relation to the system changes coming to the game. Obviously, things like the new armor system looked pretty cool, the gear tiers as well. I think generally was an exciting prospect for players, but there was also an awareness, and Bungie had kind of outlined the fact that we were going to get less content going into this new model. It also became clear that they were going to lean on existing content in Destiny to support the live game. And we additionally heard about components like featured gear, where Bungie were going to almost soft sunset rewards in this cyclical manner, which didn't make things totally irrelevant, but certainly affected the desire that players would have to actually continue to use gear because of missing out on power and even reward quality. So before we even got to the launch of Edge of Fate, there were question marks there. And again, some of that is because the system simply sounded bad on paper, right? Featured gear was a big one. I remember explaining to people how this system would actually work, and I think at the time a lot of people didn't understand that yet. And so we started to see the early warning signs that, hey, a bunch of these components might not be that great. Then we got to Edge of Fate itself. Kepler and the Edge of Fate content was not necessarily mind-blowing. Also, at the same time, players can almost kind of forgive a less awesome content drop if it's something that we play for a couple of months and then we move on. Especially if the thing that we get after that is much better, right? And ultimately, down the road, I think Renegades has done a lot of very cool stuff, but Edge of Fate started out with lower player numbers than we'd ever seen for a Destiny expansion. Obviously, Bungie would have not been happy with that. Unfortunately, of course, it was only the beginning, because once we'd cleared out the Edge of Fate content in itself, gotten our heads around the portal, and first-hand experience of the new, very massive power grind that existed early on in Edge of Fate, it's safe to say players had a lot of issues with the way that the game was presenting, and Bungie have since acknowledged that they probably made too many changes too quickly, which ultimately made it very difficult to manage the problems in the game, and extended the response time where Bungie could actually make changes. So naturally, in the 2 or 3 months after Edge of Fate dropped, We lost more and more players, which again would have been making Bungie feel pretty uncomfortable. Then there was Ash and Iron, which for the Edge of Fate era, again, I'm not trying to simply be harsh, but ultimately it was the final nail in the coffin for that period of time, because in some respects it was kind of confirmation that, hey, this is the way Destiny works now. This is a season of content, right? Not only that, but Reclaim was flawed as an activity, and additionally, we were also seeing a massive amount of stuff broken in the game, and Bungie struggling to implement fixes. We had patches every single week for months and months. It just went on. Now, one small positive that we might be able to take from how Edge of Fate and Ash and Iron went is that this was a very new world for Bungie in terms of developing Destiny content with a smaller team. And they also hadn't anticipated that they would have to go back to so many systems in Edge of Fate to actually try and fix them, which meant that Bungie were very stretched in terms of resources. And so the minor positive that we might be able to take from this now is that hopefully Bungie will be able to streamline the way that they produce content with their current teams for the game. Of course, it isn't over yet because players are waiting for the roadmap that we'll get hopefully in early 2026, where a lot of players want to see what Bungie's plans are to change the portal, progression systems in the game, even content delivery to an extent. And so alongside producing more expansion content for the upcoming year, Bungie definitely have their work cut out for them to figure out a bunch of Destiny's problems. We did, however, end the year with a glimmer of hope, and beyond that, some pretty good content in Renegades itself. Going into Renegades, again, player numbers have struggled a lot because I think Bungie have burnt a lot of bridges over the last couple of years with players. And obviously that's a shame. Those of us who are enjoying Renegades at the moment and have enjoyed the initial launch of it would probably argue that this is not necessarily saying it's the best thing that Destiny's ever had, because I don't think it is, but Lawless Frontier, for instance, and some of the pursuits around Renegades, like the Praxic Blade, have been implemented really nicely, right? It's some of the best content design overall that we've had ever in Destiny. So there's this weird juxtaposition between how a lot of former Destiny players and community members feel and the reason that they didn't come back for this particular content drop versus the things that Bungie have actually done really well. And there's almost a parallel there between episode Heresy, which was arguably the best episode of the final shape year, and then Renegades, which most of us would probably agree is the best content we've had in Year of Prophecy. Importantly though, there's a glimmer of hope, and Bungie are saying that they will announce a plan in 2026 to move into a more positive place, so that's interesting. And right at the end of the year, Bungie did another announcement for Marathon, which has really been focused a lot on showing and demonstrating how Bungie have improved Marathon from its initial announcement, the alpha that we got at the start of the year, or early in the year, and then the things that they've changed since. Most of us as Destiny players are not going to be huge Marathon fans, so we're not going to focus on it loads, but ultimately it means Bungie are ending 2025 on a more positive note than where we started, at least in terms of the content they're producing and potentially public perception around both of the titles that they're going to be supporting moving into the new year. As we have discussed though, between perception around Destiny 2, the big changes that Bungie made in Edge of Fate and the issues that that's caused, then the disaster announcement for Marathon, Bungie have had one of their roughest couple of years actually, which in many ways started with those layoffs that occurred before the final shape happened. That would have been a horrible time for a lot of people in the studio. And then what we've seen as players of the games in 2025 is kind of the delayed side effect of all of that stuff that was going on internally a year before we got to Heresy, Marathon, Year of Prophecy and beyond. So it's certainly been very interesting to see it play out, and importantly, for those of us who are fans of Destiny and who follow Bungie in general, the journey is absolutely not over. Bungie have got the launch for Marathon coming up in just a couple of months' time, and there's an expectation from the Destiny player base that we'll get the communications about Bungie's longer-term plans, as well as their 2026 plans, which are immensely important in the relatively near future in terms of securing the Destiny franchise moving forward. So there's absolutely more to come, but as we've discussed, I think there are glimmers of hope there. So now the question is, can Bungie nail the landing? Some would say no, because we're going to be in a different world to where we were a couple of years ago. It's just a fact. I don't think Destiny's going to be dropping expansions that get 300,000 players on Steam or whatever. But in many ways, we never expected Destiny to simply go on forever at the exact same level as before. That doesn't mean, though, that it doesn't have a future. So give me your impressions on how you think things will go moving forward. Where do you think Destiny will be in 6 months or a year? How do you see Marathon panning out? And how do you see that affecting Bungie's future? Because that's the other big part of the conversation and things that players have been tracking is their relationship with Sony, Sony's influence over the studio, and how much of their independence they'll maintain moving forward. Another part of this weird year that Bungie have had, Pete Parsons is gone, of course. So it's been a wild ride and it's not over yet. Give me your thoughts about it down below. If you've enjoyed this kind of recap, general thoughts on 2025, a rating would really help us out as well. But for now, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have an awesome day.